The fiddle music scraped to a sudden halt, leaving nothing but the sound of cruel laughter echoing off the wooden walls of the Grange Hall. Ephraim stood alone near the refreshment table, his weathered cowboy hat held tightly in his calloused hands. He was 48 years old, his hair graying at the temples, and his left leg bore the permanent stiffness of a wild horse fall from a decade ago. He had only asked the mayor's daughter for a simple walk, a polite and harmless gesture from a man who rarely left his isolated ranch to attend town gatherings. Instead of a polite decline, he received a loud, mocking refusal that drew the attention of every young ranch hand in the crowded room. A loudmouthed cowboy named Miller stepped forward from the crowd, slapping his knee in exaggerated amusement. Miller declared loudly that old men with ruined legs had no business on a dance floor, suggesting Ephraim ought to be put out to pasture before he broke a hip and burdened the town. Doctor. The younger crowd erupted into fresh laughter. The humiliation settled over Ephraim like a heavy winter blanket. The consequence was immediate and harsh. He felt the familiar sting of being cast aside, of realizing the town only saw him as a broken relic of the frontier rather than a man who had helped build it. He tightened his grip on his hat rim, preparing to turn and walk out into the accepting his painful defeat. Then the floorboards groaned under a massive weight. In the back row of folding chairs, a woman stood up. Her name was Adelaide, and she towered a full 6 feet and 3 inches above the floor. She was a giant of a woman, her shoulders broad and her arms corded with the heavy, undeniable muscle of years spent hauling timber in the unforgiving northern logging camps. She wore a simple gray dress that stretched tightly across her powerful thighs and thick biceps, but her face held a quiet, feminine dignity that most folks in town were too intimidated to notice. She had moved to the settlement only a month ago seeking a quiet life, but she was used to the stares, the whispers, and the way people treated her like a beast of burden rather than a lady. It is a strange thing how a single moment of courage can change the course of 2 lonely lives. Settle in and tell me where you are listening from, because this is a story about the true meaning of strength. Adelaide did not shout or make a fuss. She simply walked across the open floor, her heavy leather boots falling with deliberate, echoing rhythm. The laughter died in the throats of the younger men as she approached. She stopped directly in front of Miller, her sheer size forcing the arrogant cowboy to take a nervous, stumbling step backward. She did not even look at him. Instead, she turned her gentle, observant eyes down toward Ephraim. She saw the weathered lines of hard work on his face, the quiet honor in his posture, and the deep sting of embarrassment he was trying so hard to hide. She extended a massive, calloused hand toward the older cowboy. She asked him in a soft, steady voice if he would do her the honor of a waltz, since the other men in the room clearly lacked the spine for it. Ephraim stared up at the giant woman. He saw the sheer physical power radiating from her enormous frame, but more importantly, he saw the deep compassion in her eyes. She was offering him a lifeline, a chance to reclaim his pride in front of the very people who had just tried to strip it away. He swallowed his embarrassment, straightened his back, and placed his hand in her. Her grip was incredibly strong, yet surprisingly warm and gentle. The fiddle player, sensing the dramatic shift in the room, hastily dragged his bow across the strings to start a slow, melodic tune. Adelaide led Ephraim to the center of the floor. Because of his stiff leg, his movements were naturally slow and uneven, but Adelaide adapted instantly. She used her incredible strength to silently bear a portion of his weight, guiding him with such smooth, careful control that his limp seemed to vanish into the rhythm of the music. She did not lead the dance to diminish his manhood. She merely provided the solid foundation he needed to stand tall. The room watched in stunned silence. The mockery was entirely gone, replaced by a mixture of awe and unease at the sight of the towering, heavily muscular woman gently dancing with the aging rancher. For Ephraim, the noise and judgment of the town completely faded away. He looked up at Adelaide, realizing that this towering woman knew exactly what it felt like to be judged by outsiders. He murmured a quiet word of thanks. Adelaide simply smiled, the expression softening her resolute features, and replied that a good man should never have to stand alone. They finished the dance without another word, the quiet companionship speaking louder than any boast or threat could have. When the music ended, Ephraim escorted her back to her chair, offering a deep, respectful nod. But as he turned to finally leave the hall, he noticed Miller and 3 other ranch hands slipping out the side door, their faces tight with wounded pride and malice. Ephraim knew the look of dangerous men who had been embarrassed and needed to take it out on someone, to feel big again. He stepped out into the cool night air, buttoning his worn leather vest against the chill. He began the long walk back to his isolated horse, wondering if he had just invited destruction to his doorstep. A moment later, he heard the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel behind him. He turned to find Adelaide following him into her massive silhouette blocking out the stars, and he realized the long night was far from over. Ephraim stopped in the middle of the dark dirt road, the chill of the night wind pulling at his faded red work shirt. He turned, the gravel crunching beneath his worn, and looked up at the towering silhouette of the woman who had just saved him from humiliation inside the Grange Hall. "You should not be out here," Miss Ephraim said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The town limits are not safe for a woman walking alone in the dark." Adelaide closed the distance between them, her heavy leather boots moving with surprising quietness for a woman of her immense size. "I am not walking alone," she replied, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight. "And neither are you." Before Ephraim could argue, the shadows near the livery stable detached themselves from the darkness. For figures stepped out into the moonlight, blocking the road that led out toward Ephraim's isolated ranch. At the center stood Miller, the young ranch hand who had mocked Ephraim at the dance. He held a length of braided rope, slapping it rhythmically against his thigh. "Looks like the old cripple needs a nursemaid to see him home," Miller sneered, the whiskey on his breath carrying on the wind. The 3 men flanking him chuckled, fanning out to circle them. Ephraim felt a cold, familiar knot tighten in his chest. He was 48 years old, his left leg was stiff and unreliable, and he knew perfectly well he could not win a fight against 4 young, angry men. But a lifetime of frontier pride demanded he stand his ground. He reached out, gently pushing Adelaide behind his shoulder, a deeply ingrained instinct to protect a lady, even one who towered over him. "Go on back to the music, Adelaide," Ephraim said quietly, never taking his eyes off Miller. "This is between me and them." Adelaide did not move. She felt the warmth of his calloused hand against her arm, a gesture of protection she had never experienced in her life. In the logging camps, men had always expected her to do the heavy lifting, to fight, to endure. No man had ever stepped in front of her to take a beating on her behalf. The quiet honor of it stirred something deep and protective within her chest. As Miller took a confident step forward, Adelaide stepped around Ephraim. She did not rush. She simply placed her massive frame between the aging cowboy and the angry ranch hands. In the pale moonlight, the sheer scale of her heavy, wildly muscled shoulders and thick, corded arms became terrifyingly apparent. "Get out of the way, freak," one of Miller's friends spat, taking a step toward her. Adelaide reached out. Her massive, calloused hand closed around the man's shoulder. With a single fluid motion born of years hauling raw timber, she lifted him entirely off his feet and hurled him into the wooden wall of the livery stable. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs with a sickening thud, and he crumpled into the dirt, gasping for air. The other 3 froze. Miller stopped slapping the rope against his leg. Adelaide took one deliberate step toward Miller. Her broad chest expanded with a slow, powerful breath. "This man showed me kindness tonight," she said, her voice completely calm, devoid of any frantic emotion. "If you wish to lay hands on him, you will have to break me first. And I promise you, boys, I do not break easily." Miller stared up at the giant woman, realizing with a sudden, humiliating clarity that she could snap his neck without breaking a sweat. The false courage the whiskey had given him vanished. He backed away, gesturing for his remaining friends to gather the man on the... Without another word, the four of them scrambled into the darkness. Adelaide stood still for a long moment, making sure they were truly gone. Then she turned back to Ephraim. She expected to see fear in his eyes. She expected him to look at her the way everyone else did, like a monster, a brute, a towering spectacle of unnatural strength. Instead, Ephraim was staring at her with a mixture of shock and wounded pride. He took off his weathered hat, running a hand through his unkempt graying hair. I did not ask for you to fight my battles, Ephraim said, his voice thick with frustration. He was grateful to be in one piece, but the reality of needing a woman to save him from a beating stung his fierce independence. I have handled my own trouble my whole life. I know you have, Ephraim, Adelaide replied softly, the intimidating giant of a moment ago replaced entirely by the gentle woman he had danced with. But you should not have to handle it alone. Not tonight. The adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade, and Ephraim suddenly shifted his weight, wincing as a sharp spike of pain shot through his stiff left leg. He stumbled slightly, and before he could fall, Adelaide was there. She caught him by the elbow, her grip incredibly strong but perfectly measured so as not to hurt him. Let me walk you the rest of the way, she offered, looking down at his leg and then back up to his weathered face. Ephraim wanted to refuse. He wanted to straighten his back and walk away into the dark alone, just as he had done for the last 20 years. But as he looked into her observant, compassionate eyes, he found he could not summon the strength to push her away again. He nodded once, a slow, reluctant concession. They walked in comfortable silence for nearly 2 miles, the lights of the settlement fading behind them. Adelaide shortened her long strides to match his uneven, painful pace, using her massive presence to shield him from the biting night wind. When they finally crested the last hill, the moonlight revealed Ephraim's isolated property. Adelaide stopped. The horse ranch was a heartbreaking sight. The fences were sagging, sections of corral were held together with mismatched wire, and the main barn roof had a severe, dangerous sag on one side. It was clearly the home of a proud man who simply no longer had the physical strength to maintain what he had built. Ephraim saw where she was looking. He felt the heat of shame rise in his neck. This was his greatest secret, the undeniable proof that his best days were behind him and that he was slowly losing the only thing he had left in the world. He waited for her to offer pity, preparing to angrily ask her to leave. Adelaide did not offer. She studied the heavy, collapsed beams of the barn roof, her mind calculating the weight of the timber. Then she looked at the calluses on her own massive hands. I have no work in town yet, Adelaide said quietly, looking back at his weathered face. I will be back at first light. We have a roof to fix. The morning air was bitter and sharp, carrying the heavy frost of late autumn. Ephraim woke before the sun, his stiff left leg throbbing with a familiar, dull ache. As he stood by his cast-iron stove waiting for the coffee to boil, he looked out the window toward the sagging barn. A part of him hoped the giant woman had changed her mind. His fierce, lifelong pride still stung at the memory of being rescued, and the thought of accepting charity from a stranger felt like a final admission of defeat. He poured a steaming cup of dark coffee, braced himself against the cold, and pushed open the heavy wooden door of his cabin. He stopped dead on the porch. Adelaide was already there. She had stripped off her heavy outer coat, wearing only her simple gray dress in the freezing morning air. Her sleeves were rolled up past her shoulders, exposing the thick, heavily corded muscles of her massive arms. She was not waiting for instructions or asking for permission. Using a thick length of braided hemp rope, she was dragging a massive, weathered timber beam from the old woodlot behind the corral directly toward the barn. It was a piece of solid oak that would have normally required a team of draft horses to move, yet she pulled it with a steady, rhythmic determination, her heavy leather boots digging deep into the frosted dirt. Ephraim stood in silent awe. He had spent his entire life around strong men, but he had never witnessed raw physical power like this. Yet, what struck him most was not her overwhelming size. It was the absolute lack of complaint. She was not showing off or seeking praise. She was simply doing what needed to be done. He swallowed his pride, walked down the steps, and approached her. When she heard his uneven footsteps, she stopped and wiped the sweat from her brow, offering a soft, polite nod. Ephraim did not tell her to stop. He did not tell her he could handle it alone. Instead, he held out the tin cup of hot coffee. Adelaide took it, her enormous, calloused hand dwarfing the cup. She thanked him quietly, the steam rising between them in the cold morning air. They worked together for the next 6 hours, and a strange, unspoken rhythm developed between them. Ephraim knew every inch of the old barn. He knew exactly where the rot lived, how the joints were supposed to bear weight, and where the new supports had to go. He provided the knowledge, the careful measurements, and the sharp cuts of the saw. Adelaide provided the sheer, undeniable force required to make his plans a reality. When it came time to hoist the massive oak beam into place to brace the sagging roof, Adelaide stepped under the timber. She rested the heavy wood across her wildly muscular shoulders, planted her thick thighs wide, and drove her weight upward. The old barn groaned as she physically lifted the collapsing roof back into alignment. Ephraim hastily drove the heavy iron nails into the joints, securing the wood while she bore the immense crushing weight. As he worked, he realized something profound. Just as she had done on the dance floor the night before, Adelaide was silently bearing the heaviest burden so that he could maintain his balance. She was not taking his place. She was giving him the foundation he needed to stand tall in his own home. By midday, the dangerous sag in the roof was gone. The barn stood strong again, a temporary victory against the slow decay of his ranch. They sat together on a worn wooden bench outside the corral to share a simple meal of dried beef and cold biscuits. Ephraim looked at the repaired roof, then looked down at his own weathered hands. He felt a rare sense of peace settling over him. He realized that for the first time in 20 years, he was not entirely alone in his struggles. He looked over at Adelaide. She was covered in pale sawdust and sweat, her light brown hair messy and wild, but she looked completely at peace. Nobody was staring at her. Nobody was judging her size. She was simply resting after an honest morning of hard work. "I built that barn 20 years ago," Ephraim said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "It is a hard thing to watch the things you built slowly fall apart because you no longer have the strength to hold them up." Adelaide looked at him, her observant eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Things do not fail just because they get weathered, Ephraim. Sometimes they just need a new pillar to help bear the weight." Before Ephraim could answer, the sound of approaching hooves broke the quiet afternoon. A solitary rider crested the hill and trotted into the yard. It was Sheriff Lawson, a man Ephraim had known for a decade. The sheriff pulled his horse to a halt, his eyes widening as he took in the sheer size of the giant woman sitting on the bench, and then looked up at the freshly repaired barn roof. The sheriff tipped his hat, but his face was grim. He did not come with pleasantries. He warned Ephraim that the young man from the night before, Miller, had spent the morning complaining to his father. The older Miller was a wealthy man who owned the town bank and held considerable influence over the local mercantile and the livery. The sheriff delivered the cold reality. Because Adelaide had humiliated the boy, the Miller family had declared that anyone who hired the giant woman or purchased horses from Ephraim would face immediate financial ruin. The temporary victory of the morning vanished, replaced by a crushing new reality. The sheriff turned his horse and rode away, leaving a heavy silence behind. Ephraim felt a cold knot of guilt tighten in his chest. He looked at Adelaide, realizing that by defending him, she had destroyed her own chance at a quiet life in this settlement. He stood up, his jaw tight with resolve. He told her she had to leave. He explained that he could not pay her, that his ranch was already, and that tying herself to a stubborn, limping old cowboy would only bring her starvation. He told her to pack her things and walk away while she still could. Adelaide did not stand up. She simply looked at the repaired barn, and then up at his deeply troubled face. She had spent her whole life being sent away when she was no longer useful. For the first time, a man was trying to send her away to protect her. "I did not ask for wages, Ephraim," she said softly, her voice carrying the undeniable weight of a promise. "And I do not run from bullies. The roof is fixed. Now we need to figure out how to feed your horses." The ride into the settlement that afternoon was thick with an uneasy silence. Ephraim sat rigidly on the wooden bench of his battered wagon, the reins loose in his calloused hands. Beside him, Adelaide sat tall and quiet, her presence a steady anchor against the bitter autumn wind. They pulled to a stop in front of Higgins' mercantile. Ephraim stepped down, his stiff leg protesting the cold, and walked through the heavy wooden doors with Adelaide right behind him. Mr. Higgins, a nervous man with thinning hair, was sweeping the floor. When he saw Ephraim, he stopped, his face draining of color. He leaned the broom against the counter and wiped his hands on his, unable to meet the older cowboy's eyes. "I am sorry, Ephraim," Higgins said, his voice trembling slightly. "Cannot sell you feed. Not oats, not hay, not even salt blocks." Ephraim stood perfectly still, his jaw tightening beneath his salt and pepper beard. "I have coin, Higgins. I am not asking for credit. It is not about the money," the storekeeper whispered, glancing nervously out the front window. "Mr. Miller sent word this morning. He holds the note on this store. He said if I do any business with you, or with the lady, he will call in my debts by Friday. I have a family, Ephraim. I cannot lose my business." Ephraim felt the familiar, crushing weight of defeat settle over his shoulders. His fierce pride flared, but he swallowed it down. He would not beg, and he would not force another man to ruin his family on his behalf. He gave a slow, measured nod, touched the brim of his weathered hat, and turned toward. As they walked back to the wagon, Ephraim looked out toward the horizon. "I will have to turn the herd loose on the open range," he said, his voice completely hollow. "They will not survive the winter out there, but I cannot let them starve in my pens." Adelaide did not climb into the wagon. She looked down the main dirt street, near the edge of town, where the frost had melted into a treacherous depression. A heavy freight wagon was hopelessly bogged down. The rear wheels were sunk past the axles in thick, freezing mud. The freighter was shouting, desperately whipping his exhausted team of mules, but the heavy wagon, piled high with burlap sacks of grain and supplies, refused to budge. A small crowd of townsfolk stood on the wooden boardwalks, watching the struggle without offering a hand. Adelaide turned to Ephraim. "Drive the wagon over there." Ephraim frowned in confusion but clicked his tongue, guiding his horses down the street. When they reached the mud pit, Adelaide stepped in front of the freighter, raising a massive hand to stop his whip. "You are going to kill those animals," Adelaide said calmly. "I am going to lose my load if I do not get it to the mining camp by dark." The freighter shouted back, wiping sweat from his dirt-streaked face. Adelaide looked at the cargo. "I will lift your wagon out of this rut for 3 sacks of your finest oats." The freighter stared at the towering woman, taking in her broad shoulders and heavily muscled arms. He scoffed, but desperation won. "If you can move this iron beast, lady, I will give you 4. Adelaide did not hesitate. She walked directly into the freezing, knee-deep mud, ignoring the way it ruined her simple gray dress. She waited behind the wagon, assessing the heavy wooden frame. Bending her thick legs, she wedged her massive right shoulder beneath the rear corner of the wagon bed. She planted her heavy leather boots deep into the slick clay. She took a slow, deep breath, expanding her broad chest, and drove her weight upward. The physical effort was immense. The veins in her neck stood out, and the corded muscles of her arms and thick thighs trembled under the crushing, impossible burden of the loaded freight wagon. The town watched in stunned, absolute silence. With a deep, groaning crack, the rear wheels broke suction. Adelaide heaved upward with a final, agonizing surge of raw power, lifting the back of the wagon entirely out of the deep ruts. "Drive!" she roared over the creaking wood. The freighter cracked his whip, The mules surged, and the wagon rolled forward onto solid ground. Adelaide stepped out of the mud, her breath coming in heavy, visible clouds in the cold air. She was covered in freezing muck, and her muscles ached fiercely, but she stood tall. The frightened freighter immediately tossed 4 heavy sacks of oats into Ephraim's wagon, tipped his hat in absolute awe, and hurried his team out of town. The ride back to the isolated ranch was quiet, but the silence had changed. Ephraim kept glancing at the towering woman beside him. He realized she had willingly made herself a public spectacle, embracing the very stairs just to ensure his horses did not go hungry. When they arrived, the twilight was casting long shadows over the corral. They carried the heavy sacks into the barn and began filling the wooden troughs. As the horses eagerly trotted up to the fence, Adelaide leaned against the rails, studying the animals closely for the first time. She frowned slightly. She noticed a tall roan with a severely swayed back. Beside it stood a gentle mare completely blind in one eye, and an old gray gelding that walked with a twisted, ruined hoof. None of them were working horses. None of them could be ridden or sold. "Ephraim," Adelaide asked softly, wiping dried mud from her cheek. "These are not breeding stock. What kind of ranch is this?" Ephraim stopped pouring the oats. He looked at the ragged, broken herd, and the defensive wall of his pride finally crumbled. He leaned heavily against the wooden fence, his stiff leg throbbing in the 10 years ago, when a wild Mustang crushed my leg, the big cattle outfits let me go," Ephraim said, his gravelly voice barely above a whisper. "I was useless to them. I lost my wages, my bunk, and my place in the world. After that, I started noticing what happened to the horses when they got too old to pull a plow, or when a careless rider broke their spirit. People just threw them away, left them to starve." He reached out, gently stroking the nose of the blind mare. "I bought this land with my last dollar. I have spent the last decade using every cent I could scrape together to buy the animals nobody else wanted. That is why my fences are failing. That is why I have no money. I just wanted to give them a safe place to finish out their days. I did not want the town to know. I did not want them to see me as just another broken thing collecting broken things." Adelaide listened, her heart swelling with an emotion so profound it brought tears to her observant eyes. This man was not stubbornly holding onto a failed business out of foolish pride. He was running a sanctuary. He was quietly pouring his life into protecting because he knew exactly how much it hurt to be cast aside. She stepped away from the fence, moving close to him in the fading light. She reached out with her massive, calloused hand and gently cupped his weathered, lined face. "You are not a broken man, Ephraim," Adelaide murmured, her voice thick with absolute reverence. "You are the only whole man I have ever met." Ephraim looked up into her compassionate eyes, feeling a desperate, terrifying warmth bloom in his chest. For a fleeting moment, the cold wind and the threats of the town completely vanished. He felt truly seen. Then the wind shifted violently. The sharp, acrid scent of burning brush swept over the corral. Ephraim jerked his head toward the eastern ridge, where his property line met the dry autumn grass of the open plains. A bright, unnatural orange glow was rapidly spreading against the darkening sky. The Millers had not stopped at a boycott. They had come to burn the sanctuary to the ground. The eastern horizon was not lit by the coming dawn, but by the hungry, crawling glow of a grass fire. Ephraim did not shout or panic. A lifetime on the frontier had taught him that fear was a luxury a working man could not afford. He grabbed 3 heavy burlap sacks from the barn, tossing one to Adelaide, and pointed toward the wooden water trough. He plunged his sack into the freezing water, his stiff legs slowing his desperate movements as he hurried toward the advancing wall of flame. The fire was moving fast, chewing through the dry autumn brush and heading directly for the weakest section of the wooden corral. The horses were already panicking. The blind mare was turning in frantic, terrified circles, her shrill whinnies cutting through the roar of the burning grass. Ephraim reached the edge of the flames and began beating the burning brush with the heavy, soaked burlap. The heat was blistering, pulling the moisture from his skin and filling his lungs with acrid smoke. He fought with every ounce of strength left in his weathered, but the fire was outflanking him. The flames licked at the dry, rotting wood of the corral fence. If the fence caught, it would carry the fire directly to the main barn, trapping the panicked herd inside the yard. Ephraim stumbled back, gasping for air, his bad leg buckling under the intense physical strain. He fell hard into the dirt, the heavy smoke blinding him. Through the thick, stinging haze, a massive silhouette emerged. Adelaide did not bother with the wet burlap. She ran directly to the corner of the corral where the flames were beginning to climb the wooden rails. She knew beating the fire would take too long. The fuel had to be removed. She wedged her thick, wildly muscled arms between the heavy wooden fence posts. Gritting her teeth against the blistering heat, she planted her heavy leather boots in the dirt and heaved. The veins in her neck bulged, and her broad shoulders strained against the immovable wood. With a violent, splintering crack, the deep-set posts tore free from the frozen earth. She physically ripped a 10-foot section of the corral entirely out of the ground, dragging the heavy, smoking timber away from the dry brush and throwing it safely into the dirt. The fire break was established. Deprived of the dry wood, the grass fire hit the bare dirt of the corral perimeter and began to starve. Ephraim forced himself back up, using his wet sack to smother the remaining embers until the terrible orange glow finally died, leaving only the smell of burnt earth and the heavy panting of the terrified horses. The cold night rushed back in, chilling the sweat on their skin. Adelaide stood by the broken fence, her chest heaving, her simple gray dress smeared with black ash and dirt. She looked down at her hands. The palms were red and blistered from gripping the hot, splintered wood, but she did not make a sound of complaint. Ephraim watched her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He limped toward her, his breath ragged. He did not say a word. He simply reached out and took her massive, soot-stained hands in his own. He led her away from the smoke, guiding her into the small, dim cabin. He motioned for her to sit in the wooden chair by the cast iron. He poured clean water from a pitcher into an iron basin, found a clean linen cloth, and knelt awkwardly beside her chair, ignoring the sharp pain in his ruined leg. With incredible gentleness, the weathered cowboy washed the ash and dirt from her blistered hands. His calloused fingers moved with careful, deliberate precision, treating her not as a giant beast of burden, but as a woman who had bled for his home. Adelaide sat perfectly still, staring down at his graying hair and the deep, honorable lines of his face. She had spent her entire life using her body as a shield for others, but nobody had ever stayed behind to tend her wounds. The quiet reverence in his touch broke through the last defensive walls around her heart. But as Ephraim looked at the angry blisters on her skin, a terrible, crushing realization settled over him. He stopped washing her hands. He looked up, his eyes dark with a profound, quiet despair. "They will not stop, Adelaide," Ephraim said, his gravelly voice trembling with a fear he had never felt for his own life. "Tonight it was the grass. Tomorrow it will be the barn. Next week it will be this cabin while we are sleeping in it. We stopped them tonight," Adelaide replied softly, trying to hold on to his hand. "We can rebuild the fence. I am not afraid of the Millers." "You should be," Ephraim said, gently but firmly pulling his hands away and standing up. He turned his back to her, leaning heavily against the wooden. "I spent 20 years fighting this town, fighting the weather, fighting my own failing body. I had nothing to lose but my pride. But I will not let you burn just because I am too stubborn to know when I am beaten." Adelaide stood up, her towering frame filling the small cabin. "I chose to stay, Ephraim. You are not responsible for me, that I am responsible for this ranch," he said, turning to face her, his voice hardening as he forced himself to do the most painful thing he had ever done. "And I am responsible for what happens to the people on it. I am a drowning man, Adelaide. I have been sinking for 10 years. If you stay close to me, I will pull you under with me. I will not allow that to happen." He walked to the small wooden chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out a yellowed piece of heavy paper. It was the deed to the sanctuary. "Ephraim, what are you doing?" she asked, a sudden chill replacing the warmth of the room. "I am riding into town at first light," Ephraim said, his voice hollow, stripped of the fierce independence that had defined his entire life. "I am going to sign this land over to Miller. I will ask him to spare the horses and give you safe passage out of the valley. It is the only thing I have left to trade." He was giving up. He was sacrificing his home, his sanctuary, and his dignity, all to ensure she survived. He picked up his weathered hat and stepped out onto the cold porch to saddle his horse, leaving Adelaide standing alone in the quiet cabin, realizing that the only way to save the man she cared for was to find a way to save his pride before. The sun came up. The interior of the barn was freezing and entirely completely silent, save for the nervous shifting of the horses in their stalls. Ephraim stood in the dim lantern light, his stiff leg aching with a dull, rhythmic throb as he threw a heavy worn saddle over the back of his old gray gelding. He reached under the horse's belly to catch the cinch, his calloused, weathered hands moving. Every pull of the leather felt like tightening a noose around his own life. He had built this sanctuary with his own sweat, enduring a decade of quiet mockery and painful labor just to have a place where he belonged. Giving it up to the Millers felt like dying, but letting the town burn the giant woman who had stood up for him was a price his honor would never allow him to pay. He reached for his weathered hat, preparing to mount, when the heavy barn door creaked. Adelaide stepped into the lantern light. She wore her heavy outer coat, her light brown hair falling in messy waves over her broad shoulders. In her massive, blistered hands, she carried a small, battered leather valise. "I asked you to stay in the cabin," Ephraim said, his gravelly voice tight with barely contained grief. "I will be back before midday. I will have the papers signed, and you will have safe passage out of this valley." Adelaide did not stop. She walked directly to the old wooden barrel where he kept his grooming brushes and set the valise down. "You have spent 10 years picking up discarded things, Ephraim," she said softly, her voice steady in the cold air. "I will not stand here and watch you discard yourself." She unbuckled the heavy leather straps of the valise and pulled out a tightly bound canvas sack. With deliberate care, she untied the thick hemp cord and tipped the sack forward. A cascade of heavy, gleaming gold double eagles spilled onto the rough wood of the barrel, the metal clinking with a sound that seemed impossible in the failing, desperate ranch. Ephraim froze, his hand still resting on the saddle horn. He stared at the fortune shining in the lantern light, utterly bewildered. Adelaide looked down at the gold, and for the first time since he had met her, the quiet, unshakable giant of a woman looked incredibly vulnerable. "For 15 years, I did the work of 3 draft teams in the northern logging camps," Adelaide said, her voice dropping to a quiet, painful whisper. "They paid me triple wages because I could haul raw timber out of ravines where horses broke their legs. I saved every single cent. I never bought a pretty dress. I never went to town. But when the camp boss discovered what I had saved, he did not see a woman. He saw a bank. He tried to force me into a marriage just to take it, treating me like a beast of burden that happened to carry a heavy purse." She looked up, her observant eyes meeting his shocked gaze. "I left in the middle of the night. I came to this settlement with nothing but the clothes on my back, pretending to be destitute. I wanted to know if anyone in this world could ever look at my massive frame, see past the muscle, and just see a woman. I swore I would never touch this gold until I found someone who valued my heart more than what my hands could carry." Tears welled in her eyes, softening the resolute lines of her face. "Last night, you knelt on a ruined leg and washed the ash from my hands. You did not ask me to fight for you. You did not ask me for coin. You tried to give away the only home you have left in the world just to keep me safe. You are not riding to town to surrender, Ephraim. We are going to buy a sanctuary." Ephraim felt a tightness in his throat so sharp he could barely breathe. His fierce, lifelong pride instinctively flared, demanding he refuse her charity. Adelaide, I cannot take a woman's life savings to patch up a broken man's failing pride. Adelaide stepped closer, her towering presence not intimidating, but fiercely protective. She reached out, placing her warm, blistered hand over his calloused fingers on the saddle horn. You are not taking it, she said firmly. I am buying a half interest in this ranch. I am choosing my home and I am choosing my partner. Please, Ephraim, do not let your pride turn me away. Ephraim looked at her massive hand resting over his, and then up into the deep, absolute sincerity in her eyes. The walls he had built around his heart for 20 years finally, silently crumbled. He gave a slow, trembling nod. 2 hours later, as the morning sun finally crested the ridge, the heavy wooden doors of the town bank swung open. The elder Mr. Miller sat behind a polished mahogany desk, his son standing smugly by the window. They smiled as Ephraim limped through the door, expecting him to hand over the deed. Instead, Adelaide stepped inside, her towering frame blocking the morning light. She walked directly to the desk and dropped the heavy canvas sack onto the polished wood with a resounding, undeniable thud. Mr. Higgins at the Mercantile told me this bank holds the paper on his store, and the notes on the grazing lands bordering the ranch, Adelaide said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. She poured the gold onto the desk. Calculate Ephraim's debts, release the Higgins note, and draw up the deed for the Eastern Ridge. We are paying in cash. The elder Miller stared at the gold, his face draining of color. His son took a stumbling step back, the smugness completely vanishing. Under the banking laws of the territory, Miller had no choice but to accept the legal tender, publicly defeated by the very people he had tried to ruin. As Ephraim and Adelaide walked out onto the wooden boardwalk, the townspeople who had gathered stared in absolute silence. The ranch was safe. The debts were gone. But as they stepped down toward their wagon, the elder Miller appeared in the doorway of the bank, his face twisted in bitter fury. You can buy a piece of paper, cowboy, Miller shouted into the bitter wind. But paper does not burn in a stove, and it does not fix a roof. Winter is a week away. You have your dirt, but you have no friends. When the snows hit, this town will not lift a single finger to help you. Ephraim stopped, the cold reality of the threat sinking into his bones. The ranch was legally theirs, but they were now completely isolated in a harsh frontier winter, relying entirely on each other for their very survival. The elder Miller's threat hung in the bitter air, but it was the frontier sky that delivered the first devastating blow. 2 days after the gold was paid, the autumn wind abruptly died, replaced by an eerie, suffocating stillness. Then, the gray clouds tore open. It was not a gentle first snow, but a blinding, roaring whiteout that swept across the plains with lethal speed. The temperature plummeted, freezing the mud into iron and turning the air into glass. Ephraim and Adelaide worked frantically. They hauled the heavy sacks of oats they had earned from the freighter into the barn, rationing the feed into the wooden troughs. The massive oak beam Adelaide had hoisted into place days ago groaned under the rapid accumulation of heavy, wet snow, but the roof held firm. The sanctuary was safe, but gathering the panicked herd from the open pasture in a whiteout was a dangerous, freezing nightmare. Ephraim refused to stop. His faded red work shirt and worn leather vest offered almost no protection against the biting wind, but he would not leave a single animal behind. He was leading the blind mare toward the barn doors when his left leg finally gave out. The intense cold had seeped deep into the old, ruined bone, causing the muscles to violently seize. He stumbled, falling hard into a rising snowdrift. He gritted his teeth, his calloused hands clawing at the floor, desperately trying to pull himself up. But his body, after 20 years of carrying a solitary burden, simply had nothing left to give. He could not stand. Through the howling wind, a massive silhouette appeared. Adelaide found him half buried in the snow. She did not hesitate, and she did not ask if he needed help. She reached down into the freezing drift and lifted the weathered cowboy entirely into her arms. For the first time in her life, She did not hate her immense, heavily muscled frame. The sheer physical power that had caused her so much isolation and grief was now the only thing that could carry the man she cared for out of the deadly cold. She kicked the heavy wooden door of the cabin open and brought him inside, laying him gently on the small bed. She stripped off his frozen leather vest and stiff boots, wrapping him in every heavy wool blanket they owned. She fed the cast iron stove with split cordwood until the metal glowed a dull, radiating red, but the chill had already settled deep in Ephraim's chest. By midnight, a dangerous, rattling frontier fever took hold. Ephraim lay shivering beneath the heavy blankets, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. The fierce, unyielding independence that had defined his entire life was completely gone, stripped away by the fever and the crushing realization of his own physical frailty. He looked up at Adelaide, who was sitting vigil in the wooden chair, carefully pressing damp cloth to his forehead. "You made a bad bargain, Adelaide," Ephraim rasped, his gravelly voice barely a whisper over the howling wind outside. His observant eyes were dark with an unbearable, quiet shame. "You spent a lifetime of logging wages to buy a sanctuary, and all you got was a crippled old man who cannot even walk his own horses to the barn. I am exactly what they said I was at the dance. I am just a burden." Adelaide stopped. She looked down at his weathered face, her heart aching at the profound depth of his wounded pride. She reached out, her massive, calloused hands gently enveloping his trembling fingers, returning the quiet reverence he had shown her the night of the fire. "You listen to me, Ephraim," Adelaide said, her voice completely steady, anchoring him in the dim, flickering light of the room. "When I was hauling timber, men only saw my shoulders. When I came to this town, they only saw a giant. You are the only person in my entire life who looked at me and saw a woman. You did not ask me to carry your weight. You just offered me a place to stand." She leaned closer, gently brushing the unkempt graying hair back from his burning forehead. "I did not buy a piece of dirt, and I did not buy a ranch hand. I bought a home, and you are my home, Ephraim. A man is not broken just because he finally needs to rest." Ephraim closed his eyes, a single tear escaping into his salt and pepper beard as the heavy burden of his lifelong loneliness finally washed away. He had spent his life saving discarded things, terrified he was one of them, only to be saved in return by the very woman he had tried to protect. But the profound emotional peace was immediately shattered by the harsh reality of his failing body. His breathing grew terribly shallow, his chest rattling with a deep, dangerous congestion. As the pale morning light finally broke through the frosted windows, the storm outside began to die down, but the crisis inside was peaking. Ephraim was slipping into unconsciousness. Adelaide knew he needed medicine from the town doctor immediately, or the fever would take him before nightfall. But the town had sworn to let them freeze, and the Millers had promised ruin to anyone who helped them. She stood up, looking at the heavy wooden door, realizing the terrifying choice before her. She had to walk alone into a hostile settlement, leaving the man she loved defenseless in an isolated cabin, and force a town that hated her to finally look her in the eye. The wind hit Adelaide like a physical blow as she stepped off the porch into the roaring whiteout. The snow was already waist deep in the drifts, turning the 2 miles into the settlement into a brutal, freezing gauntlet. Adelaide did not fight the storm with anger. She met it with the same quiet, unyielding endurance that had carried her through a lifetime of lonely labor. She drove her heavy boots into the deep drifts, using her massive thighs to plow a trench through the freezing snow. Her muscles ached, her lungs burned, and the ice clung to her light brown hair, but she did not stop. She was no longer hauling timber for men who only saw her as a beast of burden. She was walking to save the only man who had ever looked at her and seen a woman. She reached the edge of town an hour later, the wooden buildings barely visible in the howling gray. She pushed through the heavy doors of the Higgins Mercantile. Inside, the air was warm. A dozen townsfolk, caught by the sudden storm, were huddled around the large cast iron stove. Among them stood Dr. Evans, and near the counter, the elder Miller. The room fell completely silent as the giant woman stood in the doorway, covered in ice, her broad chest heaving from the immense physical effort. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at the doctor. "Ephraim is dying," Adelaide said, her voice cutting through the crackle of the stove. "The fever is in his lungs. I need you to come now." Miller stepped forward, his face tight with lingering spite. "I gave an order, Evans. Anyone who goes out to that ruined ranch is finished in this town." Adelaide did not raise a hand to Miller. She did not threaten him, nor did she raise her voice. She simply stood tall, her quiet dignity and desperate love filling the room, challenging the conscience of every person watching. Mr. Higgins, the nervous storekeeper, stepped out from behind the counter. He looked at Miller, and then he looked at the towering woman who had bought his family's freedom with her life savings. "You do not give the orders anymore, Mr. Miller," Higgins said, his voice shaking but entirely resolute. "You do not hold my note, and you do not own this town." From the back of the room, the heavy-set freighter who had nearly lost his team in the mud stood up. He walked over to the doctor and held out a heavy wool coat. "I will drive the doctor's sleigh," the freighter said firmly. "My mules owe that lady a debt, and so do I. We are going." Miller looked around the room, realizing his absolute control had vanished. The community he had ruled through debt and fear had finally been broken by a single act of profound generosity. Dr. Evans picked up his black leather medical bag, looked at Adelaide, and nodded. The ride back through the storm was perilous, but they reached the isolated cabin just as the afternoon light began to fail. Dr. Evans worked quickly, administering strong medicine and applying hot poultices to draw the dangerous congestion from Ephraim's chest. For 2 days the storm raged outside, and for 2 days Adelaide never left the wooden chair by the bed. She held his calloused hand, anchoring him to the world. On the morning of the 3rd day the wind finally died. The cabin was quiet, illuminated by the pale sunlight reflecting off the snow. Ephraim slowly opened his eyes. The terrible, rattling heat of the fever was gone. He felt weak, his weathered body drained, but his mind was clear. He turned his head and saw Adelaide asleep in the chair, her massive head resting near, her blistered hands still gently holding his. He did not pull away. Instead, he carefully turned his hand, lacing his calloused fingers through hers. The movement woke her. She sat up, her observant eyes wide with desperate hope. "You are still here," Ephraim rasped, his voice weak but completely steady. "I am not going anywhere, Ephraim," Adelaide whispered, a tear slipping down her tired face. Ephraim looked at the towering, wildly muscular woman who had physically held up his barn, fought off his attackers, and walked through a deadly whiteout just to keep him breathing. The last remnants of his fierce, foolish pride melted away, replaced by a profound, overwhelming gratitude. "I spent 20 years thinking I was a broken thing, collecting other broken things," Ephraim said softly, his thumb tracing the calluses on her massive hand. "But you did not just patch my roof, Adelaide. You gave me a foundation. If you still want a limping, graying old cowboy, I would be honored to spend the rest of my days making sure you never have to carry the heavy things alone." Adelaide smiled, a bright, beautiful expression that completely softened her resolute features. "I think we can carry them together." Spring came late to the frontier that year, but when the snows finally melted, the valley bloomed with a vibrant, fiercely resilient green. The heavy oak beam Adelaide had hoisted into place held strong, and the sanctuary was fully alive. In the corral, the blind mare sunned herself in the warm morning light, standing peacefully beside the old gray gelding. The town's quiet boycott had entirely dissolved. That afternoon, Mr. Higgins drove his wagon up the dirt road, cheerfully delivering a fresh load of supplies and tipping his hat to the towering woman who met him at the gate. Ephraim walked with a heavy cane now, his left leg permanently stiffened by the winter fever, but his back was straight, and the deep, honorable lines of his face held a profound peace. He walked over to the wooden bench by the repaired carrying 2 steaming tin cups of dark coffee. He handed one to Adelaide. She was covered in pale sawdust, her sleeves rolled up, her massive arms resting after an honest morning of work. She took the cup, her enormous hands warm against the tin. Nobody was staring at her with fear or mockery. She was simply home. Ephraim sat down beside her, leaning his shoulder against her powerful arm. He reached out, gently holding her hand in the quiet. 2 lonely lives finally built into something that would never fall apart. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and reflective storytelling. All characters, names, dialogue, events, towns, ranches, and circumstances are fictional or dramatized. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to actual events or places is coincidental. Historical details are used to create a frontier atmosphere and may be simplified or adapted for narrative purposes. Nothing in this story should be understood as historical documentation or as legal, medical, financial, or other professional advice. The story is intended for a general audience and explores universal themes such as dignity, compassion, resilience, forgiveness, belonging, family, and second chances.